and welcome to this week's episode of the Maine Challenge, where we are going to talk about the Freedom to Vote Act. In my 40 years of political work, I never in a million years thought that I would be spending time and energy working to protect the most fundamental cornerstone of our democracy, which is the right to vote. But that is where we are. Between the Freedom to Vote Act in the Senate and H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act in the House, and every state in the nation, including Maine, working on redistricting, this is a critical time. Our democracy is hanging on by a thread. So this week we get to talk to Barbara Arnwein of the Transformative Justice Center in DC to talk about what it means for people in Maine and across the country. We get to talk to our own Secretary of State, Mailin Ballot, and talk about what it means right here in Maine. And I sound off about gerrymandering, which is addressed in the Freedom to Vote Act and is one of the reasons, I think, the fundamental reasons that we are in such trouble. So please take a look and pay attention, because this is really important. Let's start with what is actually in the Freedom to Vote Act. So basically, they took what the House passed last spring, and they have made it into something that is doable and that is acceptable to all the Democrats anyway in the Senate. They have taken care of automatic voter registration, same-day registration, a lot of things we have here in Maine, making Election Day a holiday, protecting election workers, can you believe that? Making sure voting machines are made in the United States, making sure that we can see where the dark money comes from, making sure that felons have the right to vote once they're out of prison. So there's a lot of things in it that just are basic fundamental protections to make it easier for the right to vote. Our own Senator Angus King was one of the key people to fashion this bill, and let's have a look at what he has to say about how important it is.
Independent Senator Angus King of Maine, is this the last gasp? And what do you do with Mitch McConnell saying flatly no?
Well, I think we continue to have to try to talk to some of the Republican senators that might listen to reason on this. This is a moderate bill. It's a bill that's designed basically to protect Americans' right to vote. It's absolutely clear that Congress has the authority to take this action. Section 1, Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution expressly says that the states have the first crack at election procedures, but it expressly says that Congress can alter or amend those procedures. So this is a critically important piece of legislation. I am not going to give up on talking to some of my Republican colleagues and try to get them to move toward working with us on this compromise bill.
Hi, Shenna, and thank you so much. I am so thrilled on this episode of the Maine Challenge to have with us our Maine Secretary of State, who has been known around the country as someone working on democracy reform and making sure we ensure voting rights, Secretary of State Mailin Ballot. Shenna, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
I'm thrilled to be here, Betsy. Thank you so much for hosting this interview on this very important topic.
Yeah. So here we are in a situation that I'm guessing that you, nor I, nor many, many people in this country ever thought we would be in, which is we are needing to actually protect the right to vote in a democracy. And so, earlier on this year in the House of Representatives in Washington, they passed John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the For the People Act in response to making sure that states did not restrict the right to vote. And then when they got to the Senate, Democratic Senator Joe Manchin said, I'm not voting for this. And so there they were. And so we were stuck. And so now they've created the Freedom to Vote Act, which is a Senate version, which is a different pared down version. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about first is some of the people who are opposed to this are saying that this is really usurping states' rights and that states really have the right, the Constitution says states have the right to vote. And so I just wanted to get your take as a state Secretary of State. What do you think about that? Is this really getting in the state's way?
Absolutely not. And in fact, the right to vote is fundamental to our democracy and outlined in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And it is vital. Federal government has a long history of putting in place standards for voting rights, dating back to the original Voting Rights Act, Help America Vote Act. There have been a number of federal laws to protect the right to vote. This is setting in place, once again, federal standards in response to an unprecedented slew of laws all across the country. We've had almost 20 states pass over 30 laws that are trying to limit who can vote. And make no mistake, they're targeting Black, Indigenous, and people of color They're targeting low-income communities. They're trying to keep Americans from validly registering and casting their ballot.
You know, one of the things as I read the For the People Act, and and we will show a slide with everything that's in it for people to see. But many of the things that are in this bill, luckily, Maine already has, right? So automatic voter registration, which we just passed, the ability, no excuse mail-in voting, election. Well, so those are some of the things that are already there. One of the things that has come up and that Senator Collins has talked about is that she has said that Maine does not have any early voting. And that's not actually accurate, right? We don't call it that, but.
What we have is in-person absentee voting.
Right.
So in practice, I think if you ask the average Mainer on the street, do you have early voting? They'd be like, yeah, of course. I can go down to my polls, my clerk's office up to 30 days prior to the election and cast my ballot at that time. Technically, it's an absentee ballot. And there is a process of filling out the application for an absentee ballot and casting that absentee ballot, even if you're in person. But the effect is early voting. And we do it up to 30 days prior to the election. And so to suggest that early voting would be something that would be impossible for Maine to implement, that's absurd. Because what you're doing is you're taking a step out of the process. You're eliminating the paperwork and bureaucracy associated with the application and allowing people to cast the vote directly instead. And I think that makes a lot of sense for Maine. And we would have to amend our constitution if we were to do it only at the state level. But because of the supremacy clause, should the federal government move forward with this legislation, whether it's in the form of the For the People Act, S1, or the Freedom to the Vote Act, which also has early voting, that would not be a problem for us to implement it at all. And for Mainers, it would feel a lot like what we already do.
Yeah. Okay, great. And again, the same day voter, I think that in the mail-in ballot, the only change that I noticed is that it would require the states to provide postage so that that when you mail your ballot in, it would be covered. Now, isn't it true that we didn't reject, Maine did not reject ballots that came in without postage? Tell us where we are with that. Just
So
right
that's
now.
right. We don't provide the postage, but we want every ballot to count. So we were not rejecting ballots in the pandemic if postage, we weren't returning those ballots for failure to include postage. So would there be a cost associated with including postage? Of course there would. But there's always a cost to democracy, and it's a cost worth investing in because it is fundamental to everything else. As you said, everything that people care about, whether it's climate change, social justice, education, healthcare, all of it depends upon participation by the people. And that's what this legislation seeks to do, is to make sure that every American citizen has equal opportunity to register and cast their ballot and have their ballot counted and not be subverted by those who seek to undermine our democracy.
Well, so let's talk about that, because one of the things that I think is fundamental in this law that's actually very exciting is a sort of first in the nation, or first not in the nation, first in our history, a legally enforceable presumptive right to vote. And even though we have the right to vote in our Constitution, right now, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have to prove, this would require that they prove that any of these restrictive laws doesn't actually restrict the right to vote, instead of us having to prove that it does restrict the right to vote. Can you talk, I know that sounds very nuanced and very, inside, in the weeds, but I think it's really, really important, isn't it?
Shifting that burden is incredibly important. So instead of a voter having to prove that they're disparately or negatively impacted by a law, it requires states to demonstrate that their laws are not going to have that disparate impact. So for example, the voter ID provisions in the Freedom to Vote Act that was just introduced would require national standards so that you wouldn't have different requirements for voter ID in some states. And we know, for example, in Texas, they recently passed a terrible law that is specifically targeting Latino voters and other BIPOC voters. And so what the Freedom to Vote Act would do was set those national standards and require states like Texas to meet those standards and meet that burden.
Which is, and so let's talk about voter ID for a second, because I think there's some misinformation. So one of the things, again, that's going around on the more progressive side of things is that this bill requires voter ID. And as I read it, as a layperson, it just says if you have voter ID, which we do not have in Maine, but if you have it, you have to expand the number of things that you can use. So you could use a utility bill or something that came to your mailbox, which we use now for voter registration, right? It would be similar to what Maine uses for voter registration. Do I have that right?
You absolutely do. As always, no one reads legislation more carefully and better than you do. And it is true. So, and people forget, we do have an identification requirement when you go and register to vote here in Maine. And that is important. We want to make sure that the people registering are the people that they say they are, and that they're residents of the state of Maine, and that they're citizens. That is something we require on the registration side. And what the national legislation does is put in place standards. So for example, in Maine, we allow student IDs to be a form of identification to show that someone is who they say they are. But there are many states that are extraordinarily restrictive. In Texas, you can use your concealed weapons permit, but you can't use your student ID. And that type of discriminatory practice, which is encouraging some groups of voters with certain political ideologies to vote, but discouraging whole classes of voters, young people, that's the type of discrimination that we want to see end. And I think that's why it's so important that the federal government stand up, step in, and set baseline standards. And when you look at what those standards are, they're not difficult to meet. They're standards that Maine will easily meet. Many of the best practices that we have shown that have made us third in the country in voter participation in 2020 are in these pieces of legislation. And that's important to keep in mind, that this federal legislation is built on best practices in the states and is intended to stop those states, which are quite frankly anti-voter and anti-voting, where politicians are trying to pick their voters rather than have the voters pick the politicians. That's what this is trying to achieve, is baseline standards at the national level.
Okay, so there's also things in here about dark money and PACs and clean elections, and all of which Maine has, and gerrymandering, which by the time this airs, we will have had a vote on in Maine. So I don't want to talk about that too much, but what I do want to talk about is, Shenna, the last time the Voting Rights Act was passed in the Senate, it was passed 98-0. So tell me, what are your thoughts on how, in God's name, the act of voting, actual voting, has become such a political football and something that has moved us from this nonpartisan little d democracy, like this is American, this is patriotic, this is what we do, right? To this political football that says, I mean, this Freedom to Vote Act out of the gate, Mitch McConnell said, no, we're not voting. I don't think he even read it. You know, right out of the gate, he has said no. And so now Manchin is in the, trying to figure out 10 senators so he can get past the filibuster. What do you think has happened?
2020.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's so disturbing because Mainers are independent, right? In Maine, we vote the person, not the party. And we have a long, proud tradition of working together across party lines to get things done. Think about same-day voter registration, which is in this federal bill, passed in a Republican-controlled legislature, introduced by a Republican in 1973. So it's been in effect for over 45 years. We had a brief hiccup when some tried to take away same-day voter registration, and you and I teamed up with Protect Maine Votes, and the voters voted, and they voted to restore same-day voter registration. These are fundamental values that we have traditionally shared that have not been Democratic values or Republican values, they've been American values. And so what changed in 2020 was a targeted, organized, systematic attack on the results of the election. And unfortunately, those results to upend, to relitigate 2020, and to prepare potentially for overturning the will of the people in 2024 are at work all across the country. We see it in Arizona, where they allowed an outside party, a partisan outfit, Cyber Ninja, to access, to damage ballots, to take equipment out of the state, making it no longer usable for federal elections because of the chain of custody and security. protocols were broken. And at the end of the day, announce, oh, yeah, Biden won, but waste so much taxpayer money and damage our processes, damage our equipment, and damage the sanctity of the secret ballot in a politicized process designed to get as much media attention as possible to create doubt and cast aspersion on the 2020 elections. So I find it incredible and so heartbreaking that we are not seeing bipartisan leadership in Congress right now to step up and say, let's put the country over party. And so, for example, Senator Manchin and Senator King have done some really extraordinary work in looking at best practices, but also looking at measures which have traditionally not been Democratic or Republican, measures that have been practiced in Republican states for a long time that are best practices. You look at states like Kentucky, for example. Kentucky had recently passed some reforms that have some problematic aspects, but also have some very good pro-voter aspects. So I do not understand Mitch McConnell's unwillingness to even look at this legislation or have any form of legislation pass. And, basic measures, for example, prohibiting tampering with ballots and machines, you would think that you could get 100 senators to vote yes to those aspects of the bill.
So if in fact Mitch McConnell is going to hold the Republicans and we're going to see a 50-50 or 51 with Kamala Harris voting, but they say that, they're going to just invoke the filibuster, do you see that there is a way around that?
I think it's important to keep in mind that our values, the structure of our democracy, the right to vote, those are enshrined in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The filibuster is not.
Yeah.
It's nowhere in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important to keep our shared values in mind as we move forward. A technicality in the Senate should not block critical legislation that, quite frankly, is going to protect our democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope you are right and we are right. And Senator King has been doing a lot of work on this, was one of the key sponsors and drafters of this legislation. And I think in large part because Maine has been a model with your help and your stewardship of our voting, our incredible record of fair, free, fraudulent-free, and high voting turnout. So thank you for all that you do every day to make sure that happens. And we will all work hard to make sure that maintaining democracy and protecting democracy becomes the law of the land. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for being with us. I really appreciate it. So I am very honored today to have with us Barbara Arnwein, who is the founder and the president of the Transformative Justice Coalition. She has a list of credentials and credits and honors in civil rights and voting rights work that would take the entire show to list if we were going to do it. She also has a radio show called Igniting Change. If you haven't listened to it, you ought to find it. It's awesome. Barbara, thank you so much for being with us. It is an honor.
It's an honor for you to have me, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you on the show today.
Oh, this is great. So Barbara, I just want to jump right in. So here we are at this moment in history in which it feels like democracy is hanging on by a thread and like we're on the precipice of something big. And we have this attempt to try and create some federal minimum standards for voting in the Freedom to Vote Act, and certainly in HR 1 in the House side. Can you give me your assessment of how are we really that close to the brink? What's your assessment of where we are in this?
Oh, I think we're in a very dangerous moment. And anyone who doesn't know that really needs to look at what's happening in our states. Already just this year, based on what some people call the big lie, 30 states, so far there's been 31 bills passed in 19 states, vicious bills saying that you cannot get a mail ballot unless you print out and send to your Board of Elections a copy of your driver's license. Now, what era are we in? I think it's called the COVID era.
Right.
And why do people need to vote by mail, need to vote absentee? Because they cannot get out.
Exactly.
So all of a sudden, you're going to force people to either have printers in their home,
Right.
or to go somewhere where somebody can make a copy of their driver's license or whatever other ID before they can get a mail ballot. When they've been a registered voter and they're on your registration rolls, they're legitimate people, they're at their same address. Why do you need all of this? And so it's that kind of, just barriers, impediments, obstacles that are being put in the way of voters. Just think about it. They're getting rid of early voting. Making it harder for people to early vote. They're getting rid of and reducing polling places. They're saying that you cannot have drop boxes. Think about it. Drop boxes. Why do we need drop boxes? Because a whole lot of us work, especially women. We work. And when we get off of work, we want to have time to go home, fill out our ballot, drop it off in the morning before we go to work, or what else, Betsy? Drop it off after work, right? Or drop it off on the weekend, but they don't want any of that. They don't want any mail boxes, drop boxes where you can just put it in and the Board of Elections will have it and it's secure. I mean, they don't want that. So it's just this viciousness of trying to block voters when voters need everything, but they're worse than that. Yeah. It's not just the barriers that they put in the way of voters. They also have, as you've seen, some of these states have said they're just going to take over the local boards of elections.
Right.
And they're going to make the state legislatures are going to make the determination as to whose votes should count. Now, that's wicked. Yeah. That's totally wicked. And then they're not finished. They got to go a step further. They know that when they reduce polling places, that means there's going to be long lines. Mm-hmm. They know that when they got fewer poll workers, when they got fewer machines, fewer polling places, it's going to be long lines. So what have they said? They said that for people who have been standing in line for 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 hours who need some relief, they need some water, they need some food. They said they're going to criminalize people for bringing them water or food. That is wicked. And, and I always say it's criminally minded. I mean, who comes up with these laws? But people who really hate voters and only want voters to vote who they think they can, quote, rely on to give them the vote that they need. So we are at a horrible period. Our democracy is under attack. And anybody who doesn't understand that, I'm just really encouraging you, take your time and read these bills. They say it all, just read the bills.
Yeah, it's not hidden. The agenda is not hidden. It is pretty right out there, right?
No, it's not hidden at all. It's open. They're not transparent. They're not honest. No. They're saying, we're doing this for all kinds of reasons, but they're not being honest, that they just want to choose their voters instead of voters choosing their electors.
Right. We just turned democracy completely on its head. These laws.
Wicked.
It is really. It is unbelievable and wicked. And so let's talk for a minute about. You alleged. You already alluded to it. But so these kind of laws really have a disproportionate impact on BIPOC folks, on people, on low-income people, on women. I think about the people in Congress, like their privilege is showing so badly. They can't imagine that it would be hard to wait in line for 5 hours and take a day off of work.
They know it's hard.
Oh, gosh.
Some of these people, let's be very clear. They know precisely what they're doing.
Yeah.
They have said on the floor of one of the Arizona election officials actually said that their goal was what? To shrink the electorate. To shrink the electorate, people, not expand it, not be inclusive, but to shrink, make the electorate smaller. It's reported that the majority leader of the House in Georgia, actually in a private meeting of just GOP elected officials, said, Betsy, that they were passing SB 202, that voter suppression law in Georgia, because it would knock out 20% of the Black vote. They know what they're doing. This is not just accidental. They're trying to be good government. They're just overly concerned. They don't like the fact that the demographics of our nation have changed.
Right.
They don't like the fact that young voters are voting more progressive, as you've seen all these efforts right next door in New Hampshire to block, young voters. They don't like and in Georgia, where they tried to block the young voters. They don't like the fact that women, especially younger single women, vote to them in their minds too progressively. Remember, we're not just fighting racism here. We're fighting patriarchy, and we're also fighting corporatist theory, where they just want to protect corporations and not the American worker.
Right. So it feels to me like this is this shrinking minority of people, these old white men, frankly, let's be real.
That's what it is.
Know what they're doing, and they can count. And they know that they are in a majority, in a democracy where majority rules. They're not going to win. Right. Ultimately, they're not going to win, no matter how much control they have. So this is their attempt, right, to say, okay, so we're, as you said, they say we're going to shrink this vote. We're going to make this less, because if we have everybody vote, we don't win. And then issues like healthcare and climate change and criminal justice reform don't go their way. They go the way that the vast majority of American people want it to go. And then they lose their corporatist control and their, patriarchal control, right?
Right. And it's ridiculous because, their fathers did not have to go through all these obstacles, right? To vote. Their patriarchy is so wicked and so vicious. I mean, we've seen these ugly, reproductive rights attacks in various states. And we've seen, just other, policies just don't make sense for the average person. And they won't address climate change. So they really don't like, our voters, because that's what our voters want.
Yeah.
And, and instead of, let me be clear, they're not losing because they're just white men.
Yeah.
That's not what the threat is. The threat is their policies.
Right.
They want to give all the tax breaks to the super rich.
Right.
The fact that they don't want to, take care of housing when we got housing shortages. They don't want to address, the fact that we need climate change. They don't want to deal with any of this. They're too much committed to these corporatist policies, and where they're just lining their pockets. That's all they're doing. They're taking money and they're lining their pockets. And that's to them more important than anything in the world. So we, as the voter, have to be really arguing to the Senate of the United States that it's time for you to do your job.
Right.
Pass the Freedom to Vote Act now. Let's protect America's democracy now.
Okay.
Not tomorrow, now.
Right today, right. I know exactly. So, and we know that that's in trouble. We know that the filibuster, blah, blah. So, Barbara, what's our path forward? What do you see is there hope? Is there any hope? Is there a path forward here?
I think that they will break the filibuster.
Yeah.
I do believe that. I think that it's clear that Manchin gets it, that there needs to be some kind of reform. Okay. And he knows, as being a former Secretary of State, he knows that this is vicious stuff.
Yeah.
He knows they shouldn't be taking over local boards of elections. He was a Secretary of State. He knows what that means. He knows what, when he sees them taking away the powers of the Secretary of State and giving it to the state legislature, he knows what all that means. Yeah. He understands what it means for the public to keep outcrying for, why can't Election Day be a holiday? He knows why people say that. I mean, he gets it. So the problem is, I think that ultimately, despite all of his, I want it to be bipartisan, when he realizes that they're not willing to move an inch, that they're willing to allow their state units to just continue to suppress the vote, I think that he'll side with democracy. I do. And I think that they will break the filibuster. And I think that Joe Biden will ultimately come out and say, do that.
Do that.
My issue isn't just with the Senate. I want that president of the United States to be the president of the United States and build some leadership in this moment also. So I just think it's so important for everyone who's listening. If you haven't called your senators, call them right now, 202-224-3121. That's the Congressional Switchboard, 202-224-3121. Call, and it's not that hard. You shouldn't be sitting up there scratching your head saying, oh, I'm not sure I know about my senator who's my congressional person. Just call and they'll figure it out. They'll send you to the right person, and they do it fast.
Okay, awesome. And that's what we need. And we have one of the critical senators potentially, right? Senator Collins, potentially, at least according to her own words, and certainly how the media treats her here in Maine, right? She is potentially a Republican who could potentially see that this is a moment for democracy.
And so you should be peppering her with calls.
Yeah, she should
because she's got the rhetoric. Let's see her do the action.
Yep.
Let's see her do the action. The rhetoric is not what we need right now. We need the assurance of her vote and protect democracy. Stop protecting all of your evil, wicked colleagues who are hell-bent on destroying democracy.
Right.
You have to step up in this moment and be a leader.
Right.
Come on now. She should be out there yelling and screaming about what's wrong with these voter suppression attempts. 400 bills pending. People want to pass even more voter suppression. Come on, we got these people running around. The My Pillow guy is in Alabama getting their voter list. Why is he getting their voter list? For what purpose? This is all voter suppression, voter intimidation, voter deception. We need people like her to use their voice in a nonpartisan way to protect the American people.
Yeah, and we need to use our voice. I don't know about you, but I find lots of people who get excited about criminal justice reform, about climate change, and about healthcare, but talking about the actual processes of democracy, I don't think any of us, you or me, I know you've been working a long time. I never thought I'd have to be using my activist muscle and my activist time for the right to vote, right? And I just never thought it was going to happen. So here we are, but this is critical. We need to do this now, right? I hear you loud and clear, and I couldn't agree with you more.
I always felt that, once this country got to a point where demographically it was shifting a lot, that you either make a decision that we're going to be a multiracial democracy, that we're, that the patriarchal, control that's been exerted all these years, where you look at it, your average state legislature is less than 25% women. Come on, folks. These are people making these laws. And you say, how did you end up with a law saying that, if a girl is the victim of rape or incest, that she has to, quote, she can't, have a right to terminate that potential pregnancy? Come on now. This is because you got men dominating who don't have, a sense. And how else do you end up with all these, anti-protest laws? And you saw that DeSantis got called out by a judge just this weekend because he got confused between a Black celebration of joy and a protest. That's what happens when you don't have, the right people around you who are inclusive and multiracial. So we just have to understand that we're in an era where all of this has to give, and people don't want to give. They want to hold on to power at any cost, even if it means destroying our democracy. So we are the ones who have to stand up. We are the people. I always remind people that the Constitution doesn't say we the Senate. It doesn't say we the Congress. It doesn't say we the Supreme Court, we the president. It says we the people. And we the people got to stand up in this moment and demand that everything is done to preserve our democracy.
And that is exactly where we need to be. Barbara, you are an inspiration. Thank you again for the work that you are doing every single
Thank
day.
you.
And you heard the fine woman and all the work that she has done. We need to take this on and do it today. So do something today. And thank you so much. Let's get this passed. And I look forward to celebrating with you.
Yes.
Hold on to our democracy.
Yes. Thank you for all your
Good.
great advocacy. Thank you for all that you do to educate the public. Thank you for being a great leader. Really appreciate you, Betsy.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you in person some post-COVID day.
Can't wait.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so grateful. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you.
Hey, I want to talk about gerrymandering, which is a key provision of the Freedom to Vote Act. Now, this is gerrymandering, not Jerry Garcia, not Jerry Maguire, not any of the fun Jerrys. This is gerrymandering. So every 10 years, as a result of the census, states are required to redraw the lines for Congress, state Senate, state reps, and commissioners based on the population shifts. Okay, so if more people move into an area, their district becomes smaller. If less people have moved out, then their district becomes bigger. This should be a very simple gridding process. You take the population, you draw some squares, you divide it up, easy peasy. But that's not how it works. The way gerrymandering works is that partisan politicians and the ones who happen to be in charge during that year that they're redrawing the districts go into back rooms and figure out ways to draw those lines to maximize and maintain their political power. So they don't go in and just draw squares on a grid like you and I would that would seem to make sense. No, no, no. What they try and do is draw the lines so that they keep as many of the same kind of voters in as many of the same kind of districts as they can. So the result is congressionally, only 20% of our congressional seats in this country are competitive between the parties. Only 20%. That means there are 80% of the districts that are either safe Republican districts or safe Democratic districts. And they work really, really hard, each party, to make sure that they have more of the safe districts than the other people. And what does this do? It takes away the power of our individual vote, yours and mine, and it gives them more power, so they have more power, not us. And it makes sure that the people who are in power stay in power, so that then they pass laws. It affects everything, from healthcare to climate change, even to how people vote. So the people in charge, the legislators, the politicians in charge, draw the lines to keep themselves in power, and then they pass laws to make it harder for you and I to vote. Can you say Texas or Georgia and 37 other states where they're trying to do this? This has got to stop. But you know what? I think to really understand it, we have to have a visual aid. And actually, I happen to have the perfect shirt on. See what I did there? So let's just look at my dots on my shirt. Let's just say for a minute that the big dots are the Republicans and the medium dots are the Democrats and the little smaller ones are the independents or unenrolled. Okay, great. So if we're going to divide this up, we just draw lines and we say, okay, here's a district right here. Now this one's going to be a little bit bigger because there's fewer dots here, and this one's going to be a little bit bigger because fewer dots. But it's pretty easy. We just draw some square lines and we got Democrats, Republicans, and independents in every district. Easy peasy. But that's not how it works. They go in a back room and take what should be a transparent process in a back room and they say, let's make sure that all the Republicans are in safe districts. So they take and they go like this and they draw a line here and then they go down here and then they say, oh, let's grab that one over there and let's grab that one over there. And so then the district looks like, like a crazy worm or an amoeba. And then the Democrats do the same thing. They say, oh, look right here. Look at this is a good one. So they make a district that looks like a banana. Or they say, oh, well, we don't want that many Republicans. So let's do this. We'll go this way, and then we'll go across this way. And then we got something that looks akin to the Big Dipper. And so that eventually the lines look like this. And in Ohio, they have something called the Banana District along the lake that just literally goes like this. And it's ridiculously long. I mean, it's absurd. So we have this squiggly map that is all designed to take power away from you and me. That's what it means. So in the Freedom to Vote Act, there is a thing that says these dividing up the lines have got to be done by an impartial, nonpartisan group. not by the political bullies who happen to be in charge, but by a nonpartisan group. That is common sense. Because when they do it this way, right, it makes us all cynical. And it's no wonder people don't believe in democracy, because we see what's happening. We see you. We can see what's happening. So this is one step that gets us back to the fundamentals of democracy of one person, one vote. And so when we have our votes, they count, and we compete on the fair and open playing field, and then we decide. That's what we should be getting to, and that's what's in the Freedom to Vote Act. So Angus King, sponsor, one of the authors of the Freedom to Vote Act. Susan Collins, not so much. So Angus King and your colleagues who are voting with you, thank you. Susan Collins and your colleagues who are voting no, or who are thinking of voting no, this is a moment of conscience. This could be the moment that saves our democracy. So we need you, and the only way it's going to pass is by doing something about the filibuster. So we need you to take this moment of courage, take this moment of conscience, change the filibuster, end the filibuster so that you can get this passed, or just vote for the damn bill and get 10 of your colleagues to do the same. It's pretty simple, and our democracy depends on it.